We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to see people here on a Friday in the summer. The topic of this webinar series is the 4 W's of Education in Emergencies data. Who has what data? Where can I find it? And why is this so complicated? And this is a 4-part webinar series. Some of you may have joined us last Friday for the first webinar, which focused on an introduction to the EIE data landscape. And this webinar is going to talk about navigating education development data for education in emergencies. But we've got 2 more. So if you go to the INEE website, you can find the recording from last week's session. You'll be able to find the recording from today's session. And then you can also find the plans for the next 2. So we've got a webinar scheduled for July 26th at the same time as this one on navigating humanitarian operations education data for education in emergencies. And then the final one is scheduled for August 2nd at the same time. And that is on navigating population movement and conflict data for education in emergencies. All right, so just a few housekeeping points. We ask you to mute your microphone and turn off your video while the webinar is going on to minimize background noise. We'll also ask you not to ask questions orally, but to post your questions in the chat area at any time, and we will reserve time at the end of the webinar for questions, for Q&A, and we'll respond to as many of the questions as possible. The session is being recorded, so just as a heads up, the recording has already started. And the recording of the presentation will be shared, as I mentioned, on the INEE website after the fact. So today's topic, as I mentioned, is navigating educational development data for education in emergencies. And in the last session, which shared a bit about the overall landscape of EIE data, we talked about how there are really 3 different types of data that we use in the education and emergencies landscape that are publicly available. And those include educational development data, humanitarian operations data, and contextual data. So those are the 3 topics, as I mentioned, of the subsequent 3 webinars. So today we're talking about educational development data. I'm not going to be your lead presenter today. I'm just here to introduce. And we've got 2 lead presenters with us today, so I want them to quickly introduce themselves. I think they're going to turn on their cameras to be able to show their faces just momentarily before they turn them off. But my name is Annie Smiley, and I am the Associate Director of Research and Evaluation at FHI 360. And I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute about my role with the Middle East Education Research Training and Support Program, or the MEERS program that is bringing you this webinar. So Daniel, I'm going to turn to you so you can quickly introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Shepard. I'm one of the presenters today. I'm a consultant with FHI 360 on the MEERS project. I'm also doing my PhD with Professor Mary Mendenhall at Teachers College, Columbia University. So I look forward to hearing your questions and having a discussion with you guys over this webinar.
Thanks, Daniel. And Jane, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jane Sullivan. I'm a program officer in the Research and Evaluation Department at FHI 360, and I have been working on the MEERS project for the last 1.5 years. And Annie will talk to you all a little bit more about that.
Great. Thanks, Jane. And just so everybody knows, we are, Daniel's in Paris, I'm in California, and Jane is in Washington, D.C. So we are spread over multiple time zones this morning. Well, morning for me, it's not morning for everyone. All right, let's go to the next slide. So the agenda for today is, first we're going to talk really briefly about what is MEERS, because I went over that last time. I just wanted to get anyone who's new on this webinar to get a sense of what is MEERS. Then you'll learn about what is educational development data in the EIE context, who has it and where can I find it, what can educational development data be used for, and then we'll have time for, hopefully some time for a discussion and some Q&A. All right, so what is MEERS? Let's skip to the next slide and you'll see sort of a picture of what we're working on within MEERS. MEERS is a 4-year project funded by the USAID Middle East Bureau And it's implemented by Social Impact, which is the prime organization, and FHI 360, which is the sub-organization. And you'll heard that those of us working on this webinar series are from FHI 360. So the objective of MEERS overall is to support continuous data collection, research, training, and analysis related to education, basically. So learners, teachers, education systems, and outcomes in the Middle East context. And within MEERS, which has multiple objectives and multiple tasks, the first task, which is under FHI 360, is continuous data collection on education in the crisis context of Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and its associated refugee context. So you can see the maps there below. Next slide. So under task 1 on MEERS, we've been working for almost 2 years now, about a year and a half or a little bit more, on a process of mapping what education and emergencies data is out there. We started by looking at all data, and we kind of moved towards publicly available data because we realized it was difficult to get data that wasn't already publicly available. So we ended up mapping multiple sources of data, which is what you're hearing about in this series. And we've learned that the lessons from the Middle East do apply globally. So, clearly there's a lot we can learn from looking at the context of Iraq, Syria, and Yemen about the EIE data landscape and the EIE data ecosystem. We also did a series of stakeholder consultations trying to understand what data do EIE stakeholders collect, need, and use, and what are the gaps. We held a series of strategic meetings trying to understand who's doing what to address EIE data issues and challenges. And now we're trying to move to the next step of kind of new directions for EIE data to improve the landscape. And that has included a data summit that was held in Geneva in June. It includes trainings. This is the 3rd time we've done this training. This time it's in a webinar format. The other 2 times were in person. And so we're really trying to move towards improving capacity in understanding EIE data and also improving the ecosystem when and how we can. So I am going to ask you to switch to the next slide, and I am going to pass over to Jane to talk to you about what education development data is.
Great, thanks, Annie. So now Daniel and I are going to talk about some of the tips and tricks that we found throughout the MEERS data mapping process that Annie was talking about for how to go ahead and navigate development data in the education sector. So this Venn diagram was actually pulled from the presentation last week, but I thought it was a good kind of illustration of the key characteristics of development data and how it differs from humanitarian data for education. So you can see, for example, that data in development is collected less frequently than humanitarian data. However, the data coverage and reliability is often more consistent. So we'll be discussing humanitarian data in more detail at next week's webinar, but I just wanted to kind of give a quick summary of how development data is distinct from humanitarian data. So in general, education development data serves to give you information about how well an education system is functioning for its population by providing indicators about educational resources, school access, retention, and completion, which is essentially how well students are able to access schooling and stay in school, and then indicators on learning outcomes and literacy, which is how well students are learning once they're in school. So how is development data relevant to education emergencies? In emergency settings, education development data can help practitioners understand how the capacity of a country's education system has been affected and how emergencies can impact larger education trends. Development data can also help governments identify gaps in resources and then inform planning around financing and resource allocation based on those gaps. This can then inform policies and decision-making in long term. These next two slides on the education data ecosystem are also pulled from last week's, but again, I think they provide a good summary of the international education data sources that we will be discussing today. You can see in this visual that the primary data sources for development data include household surveys, learning assessments, country EMIS systems, and then we also have international databases, such as the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, that we'll be delving more into later. There are also secondary data sources for education, such as EdStats, WIDE, which is the World Inequality Database for Education, and EPDC, which aggregate data from other sources, but often have more options for how users can interact with the data. This visual shows you the types of data that exist within each of the different sources and where the gaps are. So you can note just by looking at this table that there's more data about K through 12 levels of education in development than there is about adult and vocational education. So now we're going to do a deep dive into some of the sources for development data, and we're going to talk about how best to leverage them. So we have here a table that's summarizing some of the sources that we'll be discussing later today. The first source is UIS, which stands for UNESCO Institute for Statistics. UIS has the largest database of international educational data. The data is collected on a national level, and it is updated fairly frequently, about 3 times a year. EdStats is the World Bank database for international education data, and the data here is mostly pulled from other sources and is updated annually. EPDC, or the Education Policy and Data Center, is an online database that aggregates multiple sources of international data, and it provides data on the national and also the subnational levels. EMIS, which is National Education Management Information Systems, is administrative data on countries' education systems, and data can be both national and subnational, and the updates are dependent on the different countries. So it depends on which country is collecting it on how frequently it's updated. And then we have the ILSAs, which are international large-scale assessments. And this data can be found on NCES's site, which compiles data from learning assessments, from OECD, IEA, and national governments. This is updated less frequently, only every 3 to 5 years. And then finally, we have HGI and ILO, which are other UN sources. And this is data on years of schooling, both at the national and subnational levels. So to start, we're going to talk about UIS. As I mentioned, UIS is the most comprehensive national level source of education data. I'm actually going to jump quickly to connectivity so that you can all see what the UIS site looks like. You can see that data is organized in a tree view. So on this left-hand side, you can see that it's organized by topic, different education indicator, and then it's presented in a 3-dimensional format. So we have the indicator at the top in a sort of drop-down menu, and then we have the country on the different rows and the year in the different columns. So it's a pretty simple layout. However, the platform is extremely wide-ranging with data comparable across countries, so the simple layout kind of benefits the broad nature of this platform. But it also means that some of the the cons are that it can be difficult to navigate, and there are fewer options for additional layers of disaggregation. So another good data source for viewing UN data is the Technical Cooperation Group on the indicators for SDG 4. So this is a platform for viewing SDG indicators that pulls from UIS data directly. And I also have a screenshot of this data source. So you can see that it provides many more options for visualizing and interacting with the data than the standard UIS site, but the indicators that it provides are more limited than those on UIS because they're tied to the different SDG targets. So in this snapshot, you're seeing the data for the SDG target 4.1.5 on out-of-school children. So now we're going to try and do an activity with all of you. So if everyone, we'll see how well this works, but if everyone can make sure that your chat boxes are operational, I'm going to insert the UIS link into the browser, and if everyone, or into the chat box rather, and if everyone could try and use the tool to find the number of out-of-school children of primary school age in Lebanon in 2017. So I'll give you just a couple of minutes to do this. And once you get the answer, if you could try and enter it into the chat box, make sure that it is going to everyone, and then we can move forward. As a hint, once you select the indicator, you can use the Customize menu to choose the country. Select Lebanon. Great. That is correct. As Tanya correctly identified, there's about 61,000 out-of-school children in Lebanon as of 2017. So this is just one example of how you can use the tool. Great. More people are getting it. Awesome. Okay, so thank you everyone for participating in that. Now we're going to move on to the next source, which is the World Bank Education Statistics, or EdStats, as the platform is called. And EdStats combines data from a variety of sources, and it also offers several resources for interacting with data. So one of these resources is Country at a Glance, which provides a snapshot of key education figures and visuals for any given country. EdStats also has a data bank, which is extremely useful for interacting with data. It's an analysis and visualization tool that allows users to create their own queries and then overlay them on different visuals, including maps. And we'll be doing an activity on that momentarily. One of the benefits of EdStats is that it is easier to use, or a little bit more user-friendly than UIS, and it includes additional disaggregations by equity dimension, including wealth quintile and location. However, it contains mostly secondary data and pulls from other data sources. So if you are looking for primary data, you're better off going to UIS or EMIS systems. So now I'm going to give you all the opportunity to interact with the data bank. I did notice that this platform can be a little bit slow, so if it takes too long, then we can just move on to the next activity. But here's the link. If everybody could go to the data bank and try and find the region with a concentration of low adjusted net enrollment rates for upper secondary in 2017. So you can go to the data bank, make sure that you enter, you can select all of the countries because we're using the map function. For the time, that would be 2017. And then the indicator that you're looking for is adjusted net enrollment rates for upper secondary. And then by clicking on the map tab, you can see a nice visual of the adjusted net enrollment rates, and you can see which areas have lower rates. So this platform is a little bit more challenging than UIS. There's more areas where you need to enter information, and it does have more visualization options. In order to select all of the countries, you want to click the checkbox. For the series, you can select the indicator, and the time would be 2017. So there is a little bit of a hint on this map. You can see from the snapshot that I provided that just by looking at it, that it looks like the West Africa region has the darker shades of blue, which indicates that that is where the largest concentration of net enrollment rates is for upper secondary in 2017. So if anyone has any questions about how to navigate this, we can talk about it at the end of the meeting. So I'm going to move on to the last source that I'll be talking about today, and then I'm going to pass the torch to Daniel. The Education Policy and Data Center, or EPDC, is a database that's managed by FHI 360, and it includes a very extensive wealth of data on key education indicators that's pulled from a variety of sources. It includes administrative, household, and assessment data. EPDC's unique benefit is that it provides subnational level data and can be disaggregated by equity dimension. However, one of the cons is that the country level visuals are pre-specified and there are limited options for manipulating the data. Great, so I'm going to move to the next slide, and then I'm going to pass it over to Daniel.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks so much for getting us started. So I'm going to walk through 3 other sort of categories of systems and databases that can also be used to find specific education data that can be relevant for EIE context as well, for knowing the kind of broader educational landscape, especially in sort of receiving countries, I think in particular, those who are receiving refugees. So first off, of course, is EMIS systems, so the National Level Education Management Information Systems. And obviously, these differ by country. Some are quite sophisticated, some are open, some are closed and require a data sharing agreement to get access to. Others are not very functional, let's say. So it really depends on which context you're looking at, and we'll look at one example of a more open EMIS system. There's also some really great initiatives that have been coming out over the past several years that when you get a copy of these slides, you'll be able to click on those links from World Bank, from UNESCO, and from others on efforts to strengthen and expand EMIS systems. The pro is that this is really kind of direct from the horse's mouth. This is, direct administrative data from the country. Obviously, there still are data issues, but when you can get access to it, you can go to a higher degree of detail than maybe you can in other systems that stay at a more national level. So you could look at subnational and other sort of breakdowns. The cons are that, of course, it varies quite a lot between different countries. And also it can be difficult to compare countries because countries might be collecting data in different ways. So the example we'll look at together is Jordan, which is part of the Open EMIS initiative, which has been supported by UNESCO and GPE. And we'll kind of move to the next slide and kind of work through an activity that gets you to at least play around with one of these Open EMIS systems. And we can all hope that there'll be more such systems moving forward. And I'm going to just put into our chat box there the same sort of activity, and you'll see the link to Jordan's Open EMIS. And so what I'd like you guys to try to do, just to kind of keep this as interactive as is possible in a webinar, as Jane already started with, is do a little activity. So if you can navigate, and I'll give you a bit of a hint, so once you navigate to the Jordan Open EMIS, there are different tabs. So what we're trying to find is the percentage of girls who are in second shift schools in general or basic primary education, and that's under the Enabling Schools tab, so that's the sort of hint there. And you'll see that there's a number of other indicators there, so you might have to look around, but see if you can find the percentage of girls in second shift schools and basic education. And then for those of you that are really quick and find the answer to that quickly, then you can get the bonus question of seeing if you can find what the staff attrition rates are. So that's a sort of indicator that you might not be able to find. Both of these are sorts of indicators that you might not find at other more global resource levels. So once again, if you can type the answers, let's start with the first question, right? So the percentage of second shift of girls who are in second shift basic education using that link there. So let's see how many of you are able to find that. And it's a little bit slow, and while you're kind of looking for that, I'm just going to go back to kind of the pros and cons. And this is, of course, just one example, but the nice thing about this particular platform is it is open access and does have many indicators you might not find elsewhere. But as you'll see as you're navigating to look for that percentage of girls in second shift general education, basic education, that there's limited sort of analysis and data navigation abilities, at least in the open mode. So I'll give you kind of 1 minute to see if anyone can find the answer. So as some of you are probably noticing, the website is a little bit slow. It takes a moment to load and navigate around. Once you do navigate to the Enabling Schools tab, I'll give you another hint. You'll have to scroll down. You'll see it's kind of like a dashboard view. And the particular indicator that you're looking for is 6.8% of students in two-shift schools by basic education. and I'll give you the answer as perhaps people are moving through the website a little bit slowly, and we want to make sure that we move through the other bits of the webinar. So the answer is 25.09% of the girls in Jordan are in second shift schools in basic education. But you'll probably notice as you're looking through that there's quite a lot of data and indicators that you might not find in other resources. So with that, I'll sort of move on to the next. So we already touched on this a little bit. Jane spoke about how the other sources, such as EdStats, also have assessments. And so this is another database, another online resource where you can look at international large-scale assessments, and that's the NCES's International Data Explorer. And while I'm talking, I'm going to go ahead and paste the link in so that people can start loading it already while I'm talking through kind of the pros and cons of this particular data resource. So the nice thing about this is in one website you have pretty much all the ILSAs. You also have most of the ILSAs on EdStats except for TALIS, which is one that has data on teachers. And of course, given that we're all kind of concerned with using this within an EIE context, obviously one of the cons of ILSAs is that there's not, sorry, I was just seeing if someone had a question directly for me there. So one of the cons for ILSAs is that it doesn't have full coverage across all the countries that we might be interested in. But nonetheless, it does have some of the receiving countries that are hosting refugees. The NCES website is also quite nice for just doing basic analysis. So you can even look for statistical significance between years or between countries across different international assessments. Another thing to note here is that, of course, countries themselves are conducting nationally representative assessments that are separate and in addition to ILSAs. And so to find those, at least to find out whether or not they exist or not, one tool you can use is the tool that Jane spoke about, and that's UNESCO's kind of SDG 4 website that has different indicators linked to the SDGs. And you'll see at 4.1.2, if you go there, that it actually has yes or no, which countries have nationally representative assessments. Some of those are ILSA, so some of those are international OECD, IEA, etc. But some of them are also national level. It takes a little bit of digging to find out which one is which, but at least it gives you an overview, and then you can pick the country of interest and see what that source is for the nationally representative assessment for that country. For the UNESCO website, the focus is on reading and mathematics for basically primary and secondary. And obviously for some of the other ILSAs, you might find other things like problem solving or financial literacy and so forth, as well as, of course, data on teachers, which are important when we're looking at EIE contexts. So with that, I'm going to move to the next slide, and we'll try one other activity to kind of keep people engaged, even though we can't see one another's faces. So if you navigate to that link that I posted a moment ago for NCES, see if you can find out what year had the lowest performance for reading among fourth graders in Iran. And the data runs from 2001 to 2016. And I'll give you a hint here. You'll see that there's multiple ILSAs there, multiple large-scale assessments there. PISA, for example, is there. PEARLS is there. TIMS is there. And for this particular activity, fourth grade reading would be from PEARLS. So you'd click on PEARLS, and then you start navigating for, you want all years, you want all students, and you'll see at the bottom right, once you kind of click on PEARLS, that there's a sort of a button that moves you through 4 different steps. And then that will allow you to pick the number of the country, allow you to pick the number of years that you want, and so on and so forth. So I'll give you guys a moment to see if you can figure out using NCES which year the reading was the lowest in Iran. And Iran is obviously a country which hosts a number of refugees from Iraq still to this date. So you can imagine how this data might be informative for thinking through sort of receiving countries for refugees. And I'll give you guys about a minute to see if we have some engaged participants who can find the answer between 2016 and 2001, which year had the lowest fourth grade reading performance. And while you're looking for that, one other note I'll make is that for EdStats, you can also find a lot of these data. But when you're looking at the visualizations at EdStats, there is a small error. As we know, with many of these systems, there's some errors now and then that creep in. So when you're looking at pearls in EdStats, sometimes it says sixth graders when in fact it's fourth graders. So it's a good reminder that it's helpful to look, sometimes just double check across a few of these. But the particular strength of NCES is having all of them in one place and being able to do some basic analysis for those of you that want to get some statistical tests. So the answer is a bit hidden in the graph there, but the answer for Iran is the lowest scoring year for fourth graders in reading was in fact in 2001. So it's a little bit blocked there in the slide so that you wouldn't see the answer. I see Amy Lee got it just as I was about to give the answer. Well done, Amy. So with that, we'll move on. You'll notice, those of you that were working your way through NCES, it is a bit of a slow website, and it does take some getting used to. Each of these databases has their kind of unique quirks. But of course, there's many other UN data sets that are available and potentially useful in the EIE context. And so this is not at all exhaustive, but this is illustrative of two other resources that might be useful for us in EIE to just get a lay of the land. So one is ILO Statistical Office, provides great data, especially if you're thinking about outcomes beyond learning outcomes. If you want to link, employment rates or data or pay rates to education level, look at gender gaps in employment. You can imagine things like that being useful for certain sorts of activities, maybe raising awareness about the importance of education, for example. But also it has indicators that might be more directly relevant for us. So two illustrative ones are the NEET rate, so those youth who are not in education, employment, or training, as well as rates on child labor. And the pros are that this is kind of quality controlled data that's pulled directly from national statistical offices primarily, as well as some other resources. It's basically in a tabular format, so it's fairly easy to at least download the data. And they even have some nice tools that you can install in Excel or in R to do some basic analysis as well that kind of makes that process a bit easier for those that are more kind of analytically inclined. Despite that, it is still sort of quite similar to UAS as far as the navigation. You're still having to navigate different tables, and you kind of have to know where things might be nested under. So there's still some challenges as you get used to the individual website. And especially for data like NEET rates or child labor, there's a lot of missing data and gaps between years, so it might be difficult to do trend analysis. The other resource that we wanted to direct your attention to, just as another illustrative example of other UN data sources that have been sort of curated in a way that might be useful for us, is there's this effort to look at subnational HDI information, and of course two of the HDI elements are school-related, expected years of schooling and mean years of schooling. So if you go to this globaldatalab.org/SHDI, which is Subnational Human Development Index, you'll be able to see, across multiple countries, what the levels are in expected schooling and mean years of schooling at a subnational level, which might be more useful for planning purposes within EIE. And you'll see Yemen is there. Of course, the data becomes the same every year at a certain point, so you'd have to kind of think about when that data is being refreshed. So that's at least 6 kind of illustrative categories and databases that you could use to kind of think about the broader educational landscape that you might be operating with EIE. And just to kind of bring it all back together again, similar to what Jane introduced, it can be used, essentially this sort of data we find quite useful for thinking about the context, thinking about the capacity, if you're thinking about number of teachers, literacy rates, things like that. And the ability to absorb maybe refugee populations, or you're looking for trends at how an education system has been disrupted by conflict or emergencies within that country. And then, of course, to kind of think from a policy standpoint, where are there gaps and where are there decisions that need to be made. And you'll see the 6 resources there on the far right. So you have UIS from UNESCO, you have EdStats from the World Bank, you have EPDC hosted by FHI 360, you have national EMIS. And it's worth flagging that EPDC and EMIS systems are particularly good for finding subnational level, for those of you that need more finely grained information. Then you have ILSA, so those assessments, and then, of course, other UN data. So with that, we want to make sure that we have some time for discussion. So we're going to move now to a few discussion questions. We probably won't go through all of them. And those of you who have questions, you can go ahead, as was stated earlier, you can go ahead and start typing those questions into the chat box, and we'll kind of be going to those as much as we can during the webinar. And for those that we don't get to, we'll add some answers to appended as slides at the end of the slide deck afterwards for when we share it out. So even if we don't get to your question, we'll try to make sure we cover as many of them as possible here and also afterwards. So the first sort of kind of question for discussion is, what are the differences in using these databases? And at risk of a bit of a cacophony, I just wonder if anyone, to make this a bit more interactive than us just talking at you, since we are all educationalists, if anyone can just, ping in the chat box if they have an example of how, they've noticed that, this database is useful for X and another database is useful for Y. So kind of differences in your own organization, how you've used this. So if anyone in our audience, so that we can garner the experience and expertise of those in the room, so to speak. If you have experience using these different databases and a reflection on what you see as some of the key differences and making use of them, please just ping in the chat box, and then we can give you a moment to just share that reflection. So again, anyone that wants to speak to kind of the way they've used these databases and the differences they've noticed in your own work when you're using them for planning purposes or other purposes. Hopefully we still have many of you with us. And don't be shy. We're always interested to learn from everyone that's in the room. So as you're thinking of kind of your own sharing on this, I'll just share some reflections that we've had as a team. So something is going back to what Jane said earlier. So some of these databases aggregate together the information into sort of dashboards that are country specific. So I think EPDC is a great example of this. So if you want a great snapshot of a particular country in one place and fairly quickly, that's quite easy to navigate, I think that's a great resource. Whereas if you might be looking for a particular data point that you need, it might be easier to use, for example, UIS or EdStats or one of the other resources where you can pull that direct data point. But I just wonder if anyone else wanted to share some reflections on how they've used these different resources in your own work and kind of reflecting on that. So you can reflect on that first question or any of the other 3 questions about how you use the data, this kind of development education data in your own work in EIE, and how the data can be used and what the limitations are. So if anyone wants to ping in the chat box or raise their hand, and they can share their reflection on that. Hopefully we can have a little bit of interaction. Yeah, Claude makes an excellent point that, of course, there are many household surveys, and some of those household surveys, as Jane mentioned, you can access through EdStats. Some other household surveys, you might have to kind of track them down through other resources, but EdStats is quite good at pulling that together. You might also find some of those household surveys being pulled into other resources that we've gone through. So that's a great point. Thanks for sharing that reflection, Claude. Does anyone else have any other reflections on how they've used these data in their EIE work? We have a very quiet room for a bunch of educationalists.
Just to jump in, Daniel, someone did make a really important point during my presentation that I wanted to raise, that oftentimes, I mean, this was mentioned for UIS data, but I think it's true for a lot of the sources that we're discussing, is that oftentimes data for fragile countries is missing. And I just wanted to kind of flag that. So for UIS, for example, if you were to look at, Syria, you can see the last time the data was collected for education was in 2013, and it's missing since then. So that's kind of one of the challenges that we're working on for MEERS, and that is certainly relevant for education emergencies.
Thanks for that, Jane, and thanks for the person who flagged that. And next week, we'll be talking about humanitarian data sources. That kind of touches on this fourth bullet point here of the limitation of these sources. So these are national level, and they might not be capturing the on-the-ground situation that might be more dynamic in the case of emergencies. So, for example, the number of out-of-school children in Lebanon might be kind of one thing with the official statistics, but when you add in the refugee population, it might be something quite different. So that's something that we'll definitely be going through in the next webinar about humanitarian sources of data as well. And we really see these as quite complementary. So I'll just share some reflections we've had as a team on these three, and then we'll kind of go to the Q&A that people have been plugging into the chat box for the last few minutes. So I think that when you're planning, interventions and planning EIE projects and so forth, especially in host countries, it might be quite useful to know, for example, the number of second shift schools, the number of teachers, and things of that nature, to know kind of the ability to absorb and the ability to leverage capacities that already exist. It might also be helpful to think about, whether there's too many or too few teachers when you're thinking about policies around employing refugees as instructional support. And then, of course, there are limitations to each data set, and we went through quite a lot. So for each data set, every time you're finding data points, you want to make sure to take it a bit with a grain of salt, and use these as complementary tools to kind of see what other data sources are available, both household surveys as well as national level statistics and administrative data. So with that, I think we'll move to some of the Q&A, which hopefully has been coming through the chat box. And so I'm going to just pull that up on my end. And maybe Jane or Annie, if you want to jump in on any of those questions that were flagged in the Q&A, and then I'll take the next one. So I see one of the questions is directed at me, so I'll just go ahead and jump on that one, or directed to at least a slide that I covered. So with the open EMIS, someone asked, what other indicators there are in open EMIS. And this is just one example, of course, with the open EMIS in Jordan. But there's quite a wide range. You'll see with the kind of tabs there, there's even a tab that's explicitly about education and emergencies, which has data that's relevant specifically for our sort of work. You'll see data there that's about staffing. You'll see data that are there that's about kind of the infrastructure, about the availability of ICT in different classrooms. We're thinking about more technologically enabled interventions. So it's really quite wide ranging. And it's worth looking. You'll see once we share the slide deck, you'll see a link to the Open EMIS initiative, and you might be able to find some of the other initiatives that are out there in other countries and so forth that might be helpful.
So hi everyone, this is Annie. I'm seeing the question that came in that says, just wondering about the sources of data that's available, especially during emergencies. I give the example of Syria, where data could have been dependent on Ministry of Education, who at one point did not have access to the majority of the country. Would this data also link with cluster data, for example? So fantastic question. Certainly, the situation currently, as you've rightly pointed, is that the Ministry of Education doesn't have access. EMIS data is not being collected, as was mentioned a minute ago, for Syria. It hasn't been since 2013 for most of the country. So what we do have access to is cluster data, and we're going to be talking about that humanitarian operations data during next week's webinar, but the data does not link. The kinds of indicators and the methods of data collection used by the cluster system is really quite different than what is being used by an EMIS, by a government. And so that's one of the challenges that we're kind of grappling with as a community, and that was discussed kind of at length during the data summit in June in Geneva, was that the data doesn't link up. There isn't a way to sort of have coherence between this development data and humanitarian data that's coming from the cluster. And so what we're talking about is, at this point, is trying to move towards more coherence, and even start thinking about a set of common indicators across humanitarian and development sources, so that we can have some consistency and definitions and all of that. But yeah, at this point, we're not seeing any context where we've got that kind of linkage. Back to you, Daniel or Jane.
Great, thanks, Annie. So I think, Amelia from IEP, you're reflecting also on the Open EMIS. So yeah, under certain tabs, you'll see only a few indicators. So it kind of varies the coverage, at least that's visible within the Open EMIS system. And I think it's a good, assuming that you're referring to the Open EMIS there. I think the other thing to flag is that oftentimes you're going to have to reach out to specific districts or even schools to get access to the administrative data that's from kind of the broader school system. Say, for example, if you want to look at examination rates or transition rates and things like that. In some countries, they have that data available, and you might need, a data sharing agreement to get access to it. In other contexts, you might have to reach out specifically to, the district education office or something of that nature to get access to it. So it's definitely not always so easy, unfortunately. But I think one of the things that we are trying to do with this initiative is just improve the general awareness of the data sources that do exist. So that they can be taken advantage of, and that gaps that are filled are in fact gaps that exist, as opposed to too much redundant data collection. So it seems that we have a fairly quiet audience. So just to flag again that this is webinar 2 out of a 4-part series. And so please do join again for next Friday and the Friday after that. You'll see the links on INEE. Here at the end of the slide deck, you have our contact information for those of us who are on this webinar, as well as some other folks involved with this project, the MEERS project more broadly. So do feel free to reach out if you have other burning questions that you didn't have a chance to ask. And I think with that, I'll just see if Annie or Jane want to add anything final while we see if any other questions come in. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. So Jane, did you want to add anything?
No, nothing else from me. Thank you all for joining. and we'll see you next week, hopefully.
And from me, this is Annie again. Really appreciate all of you coming out and joining us today on a Friday in the summer. I think this was really interesting and sort of it's a lead-in really to the meat of what data we do actually find available in humanitarian contexts inside these crisis contexts, and that is really the humanitarian operations data, which we'll talk about next week, and contextual data, which I think is underrated and really important. So talking about population movement data, talking about attacks on education and security data, and how we can leverage those types of data to improve our understanding of education in emergencies. So you'll be hearing more about that in 2 weeks. That's August 2nd. And then, as you heard, next week will be humanitarian operations data for education. So really mostly looking at the global education cluster and their data. Are there any more questions that have come in? I don't think so, right?
I think we managed to cover the ones, but again, if you want to reach out, feel free to email us. And thanks once again to echo what Annie said. Thanks for joining us. I hope you learned something new, and I hope that we'll continue the conversation and look forward to all of your feedback and joining future webinars as well.
Thanks, everyone.